Hi everyone, welcome to Watch My Channel. I believe that most art lovers will feel that the head is the most difficult to control when learning to draw. They always can't find the proportion and perspective of the head, and can't draw the outline of the head well, especially some beginners who have just started to learn. They either can't find the structure and draw the head too round like a balloon, or they can't accurately draw the structure of the head and draw the transition of the structure too rigidly, feeling like an uneven stone. Haha, this is really frustrating. But don't worry. As a novice, it is inevitable to encounter such problems. After all, it is not easy to draw a good head. If we want to draw a good head, we have to start with the skull. Because whether it is a beautiful face or an ugly character, the muscles and skin of the head are covered on the skull. So only by understanding the proportion, structure, and outline of the skull can we draw an accurate head. So, how should we understand the skull? Next, I will explain the knowledge of the skull to you in several parts. Okay, let's get started now. Part 1. The shape and proportion of the skull. Generally speaking, our skull is composed of three parts: the facial bones, the posterior skull, and the mandible. We can summarize the posterior skull as an oval, and the facial bones and mandible as a shorter cylinder. So the skull gives us the feeling of a combination of an oval and a cylinder, which looks like a whistle. Separating the skull from the middle of the eye socket, we can divide the skull into two equal parts, from the parietal bone to the brow bone, from the brow bone to the bottom of the nasal bone, and from the bottom of the nasal bone to the mandible. Each part occupies 1/3 of the skull, so that we can get a proportion of the longitudinal axis of the skull. When looking at the skull from the side, the skull can be divided into 4 equal parts on the horizontal axis, and the ear is in the middle and right position. This is the basic proportion of the skull. Part 2. The composition of the skull. I have said above that the skull can be roughly divided into 3 parts: facial bones, posterior skull, and mandible. The facial bones are composed of the frontal bone, brow bone, nasal bone, zygomatic arch, and maxilla. The posterior skull is composed of the parietal bone, temporal bone, occipital bone, mastoid process, and the mandible is a whole piece. The above are the more important parts, which should be considered when drawing the head. Part 3. How to understand and summarize the various parts of the skull. After talking about the composition of the skull, let's talk about how to understand these parts. We can summarize the back of the skull as a sphere, but we need to cut off 2 small faces at the temporal bone line, because the back of the skull is not a true sphere. From the top down, the shape of the skull is more like an egg, and from a normal angle, it looks like a motorcycle helmet. The facial bones are the most complex and important, and we need to spend more time to understand this part. We can understand the frontal bone as a block composed of multiple inclined planes attached to the front of the skull. The brow bone is like a convex and curved block embedded under the frontal bone. The nasal bone can be seen as a combination of 2 trapezoidal blocks embedded in the middle of the brow bone. The zygomatic bone and zygomatic arch look like crescent-shaped blocks embedded in the bottom of the nasal bone. And the entire dental area looks like a shorter cylinder embedded in the bottom of the nasal bone. The mandible is the only movable bone in the skull. It is like a toilet lid with 2 handles connecting the zygomatic arch and the alveolar socket. Through the above analysis, I believe that everyone has a clearer understanding of the skull. But if we want to draw an excellent portrait, we still need to learn a lot of other related knowledge. If you want to learn more about painting knowledge, remember to like and subscribe to my channel. I will share more knowledge and skills about painting in future videos. Having said so much theoretical content, let's see how to draw a skull. Using this picture as a reference, first, draw an ellipse. Then determine the position of the mandible. Draw the midline and mark the position of the brow bone, nasal bone, and cheekbone. The brow bone is a raised block, and you should pay attention to its overall shape when drawing. In addition, pay attention to the turning point on the side of the brow bone, because this is the junction of the brow bone and the temporal bone. Use an inverted trapezoid and a triangle to summarize the shape of the nasal bone. The zygomatic bone and zygomatic arch are like a half-moon-shaped block. The tooth part is like a wine barrel stuck between the zygomatic bone and the mandible. Find the slope of the mandible. Note that the turning point of the mandible is not a triangle. It is composed of two turning points, which is very important. Draw the mastoid. Draw the front and side junction of the teeth. Emphasize the turning points of the cheekbones and brow bones, and then start to correct the outline of the skull. At this stage, we once again strengthen the turning points of each part to make the whole skull look more three-dimensional. Then create a new layer and use clear lines to outline the outline and structure of the whole skull. Seeing this, do you feel that drawing a skull is not as difficult as you imagine? In all paintings, as long as we understand the structure of the object of painting, no matter how complicated it looks, we can easily control it. After completing the sketch, we can paint it with a lighter base color and then use a darker gray to draw its dark side. When painting, you must find the dividing line between light and dark, and then draw the darkest color. At this time, the overall effect of the whole bone is clear. Next, we continue to find its details, draw the teeth, find the brightest part, draw the color block connecting the bright part and the gray surface, and carve its details step by step. Slowly, a three-dimensional skull is presented. I don't know if you have learned it. At the end of the video, I would like to give some suggestions to beginners. If you want to draw an accurate head, you might as well try to practice the skull at different angles. This will lay a solid foundation for drawing heads at different angles in the future. When drawing a skull, you don't have to draw it very specifically. This can quickly exercise your brain and hands and improve your drawing skills quickly. Well, today's video is about to end. Thank you very much for watching. I hope my video can help you. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave me a message. I believe your suggestions can help me produce better content. See you next time. Bye.